Welcome to another session of Understanding Human Anatomy. This video I will be discussing the spinal cord. Now the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. And we usually abbreviate central nervous system as CNS. The central nervous system is defined as the brain and spinal cord. All other neural tissue outside the brain and spinal cord is the peripheral nervous system. The spinal cord begins at the most caudal part of the brain. It begins at the medulla oblongata, and then continues down through the spinal canal and ends by coming to a point at the level of L1 to L2. Thus, the spinal cord is not as long as the spinal canal. Now, this is because the spinal cord finishes developing, finishes its growth before the body finishes growth. And so as the body continues to grow taller and taller, the end of the cord moves up in the spinal canal, so that in the adult it comes to lie at the level of L1 to L2. The spinal cord gives rise to the spinal nerves. These are the nerves that supply innervation to our body, except for the region of the head and part of the neck. They are served by cranial nerves, which originate from the brain itself. Spinal nerves come off the spinal cord one after another along the entire length of the spinal cord. And we find that they are identified by level. And the level corresponds to the region of the spinal column. So we have cervical spinal nerves, thoracic spinal nerves, lumbar spinal nerves, sacral spinal nerves. There actually is one more spinal nerve than there are vertebrae. And the extra nerve is assigned to the cervical region. There are 8 cervical nerves, 12 thoracic nerves, 5 lumbar nerves, and 5 sacral nerves. The spinal cord is covered, as the entire CNS is covered, by 3 connective tissue membranes. The dura is a membrane that is made up of dense connective tissue proper, and it forms the outermost covering of the central nervous system. Deep to the dura is the arachnoid, and the arachnoid is a rather delicate membrane that resembles a spider's web. In other words, a lot of fine filaments and processes that extend and interconnect. then right on the surface of the spinal cord is the pia mater, or the pia, and that is attached to the surface of the spinal cord, and cannot really be separated from it. You can see the difference if you look at a microscopic slide, but it is firmly attached to the surface of the spinal cord, and whenever the spinal cord is indented or projects, the pia will follow along with it. Now, there are spaces between these membranes. So, between the dura and between the dura and arachnoid is the subdural space. Now, the subdural space is what we refer to in anatomy as a potential space. That means that the dura and the arachnoid are not separated from one another under normal conditions, but that if something seeps into that space, the two membranes will separate. This is most commonly found when a blood vessel leaks blood into the space and you have a subdural hematoma. The subarachnoid space is a space between the arachnoid and pia, and the subarachnoid space is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And that is abbreviated CSF. And it bathes the entire central nervous system and helps support the central nervous system. Our central nervous system is floating in fluid, both the brain and spinal cord, and it's floating in cerebrospinal fluid. Now, there's another space that we only find associated with the spinal cord, not with the brain, and that is the epidural space. And this is a space between the dura and bone. So it's superficial to the dura. The epidural space is filled with adipose tissue. It's filled with fat. It is a space in which anesthetic may be infused to provide a type of spinal anesthesia called an epidural anesthesia or an epidural block. I want to start by drawing a cross-section of the spinal cord. So bear with me for a second here while I get the outline of the cord drawn. That's the basic outline. Then one of the first things you'll notice is that there's an area on the inside of the cord which looks a lot like a butterfly. And then in the center of the butterfly, you'll see a small opening. The central canal. And what I want to do first is point out that there's two colors when you look at a fresh spinal cord. This has nothing to do with any staining or chemicals added to it. The inner butterfly area is gray in color, while the outer part of the spinal cord is white. We call the gray area gray matter. And gray matter is composed primarily of nerve cell bodies, dendrites, and non-myelinated nerve fibers. So this is the area where you find the nerve cell bodies, the neurons. Okay. The white area is known as white matter. And white matter is formed by myelinated nerve fibers or myelinated axons. Now, that means that the white matter is made up of parts of the neuron, the axon, that are myelinated and that are carrying information from one area of the nervous system to another. This is the area in which we find tracts. And tracts are just bundles of axons, bundles of nerve fibers that are running from one specific place in the central nervous system to the other. And tracts in the central nervous system correspond to nerves in the peripheral nervous system. So we have white matter on the outside, gray matter on the inside. We're going to find that that is true throughout the central nervous system. Now, there's not really an exception, but in addition to the gray matter on the inside, in the cerebral hemispheres and in the cerebellum, there's gray matter on the outside as well, and that is called a cortex. So in the cerebral hemispheres and in the cerebellum, you have gray matter on the inside, then a bunch of white matter outside of that, and then on the very surface, more gray matter. And this is caused by the necessity to have so many neurons in these areas that they can't be contained on the inside, that you need the extra space, all that surface area on the outside to get the number of neurons that are necessary to control the body. Now, one last structure on this view is the central canal. The central canal is in the middle of the gray matter. And it is filled with fluid, cerebrospinal fluid, but it's a reminder of how the nervous system developed. The nervous system in the embryo starts out as a simple tube. Now it becomes highly modified throughout development, but the tube part, the inner part, inner cavity filled with fluid, is maintained in the adult. In the spinal cord, it's the central canal. We'll find that there are corresponding remnants of the tube in the brain as well. I'm going to stop this discussion at this point, and we'll pick up in the next one with more detail on the structure of the spinal cord. Thank you for your attention.